So let me just briefly introduce our speakers. My name is John Almeida. I'm an assistant professor here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I teach education policy. I do some research on comparisons between the US and other international nations. I have a book coming out in April on the allure of order, which you're going to hear a little bit about during my presentation. Thanks, Ray. To my immediate left, we have Bob Schwartz, from whom I learned everything that I know. The Francis Keppel Professor of Practice of Education Policy at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, former president of Achieve, which brought together a number of the states to push forward on the standards movement in the 90s and the early 2000s. Formerly the academic dean here, and he always likes people to know that before all that, he was a high school English teacher and principal, so he knows of whence he speaks. To Bob's left is Liz City, who's the lecturer on education and director of the Ed.D program here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Liz has done a lot of work coming out of practice, probably best known for her work on instructional rounds and DataWise, for which people literally stop her on the street and say, "Your work has been so helpful at my school." So you're lucky to have her here, and you can do that to her too at the reception if you want to. To her left, we have Rick Hess, who's with us from the American Enterprise Institute, where he's a resident scholar and director of education policy studies. He's the executive editor of Education Next and writes the Education Week blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, as if there were any other way to experience Rick Hess. Rick has written so many books that it is, I will not even make an attempt to name them all, but most recently he has a book that just came out called Cage Busting Leadership. So if you want to hear how you can make changes through leadership, Rick is your guy. Rick also was a teacher, and he received his PhD from here in government. And then finally, to Rick's left, we have the former Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, who we are so lucky to have back here as a professor of practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Paul played a huge role in the passage of the 2010 Achievement Gap Act, as well as helping Massachusetts win $300 million in federal funds as part of Race to the Top. Before that, he was the director of the Rennie Center for Education Policy and Research. We are just really lucky to have Paul back at the school and on this stage. So that is the plan. First up is going to be, we're not going to go in the order that we are seated, but Bob Schwartz is first up.
Thanks. So I was part of a three-person team. Works here. Better? Yeah, good. Okay. So there were three of us. Ben Levin from Canada, who's been a kind of senior person, both inside, was really the number 2 person in the Ontario Education Ministry for several years before going back to a university career now at the University of Toronto. And Ed.M. much respected researcher at the University of Wisconsin. When we began talking, at least I had very much in my mind a kind of thought experiment, which was in 1989, the Supreme Court of the state of Kentucky declared not simply the financing of that system unconstitutional, but basically said the whole system is rotten, sort of top to bottom, wipe the slate clean, said to the legislature, build a new system from scratch. And at the time, the legislature kind of amazingly kind of stepped up to the challenge, hired a couple of consultants, who largely put together a plan based not on looking anywhere outside the US for evidence or examples of effective systems, but based largely on a set of lessons from what we know about high-performing organizations. You could argue that KIRA, that piece of legislation, really was the first attempt at scale to create what became kind of the model for standards-based reform. So our question was, if another state court came along with the same invitation to a legislature to kind of imagine a new system, how would you begin? And our premise was, well, suppose you decided to actually take a look at what we now think we are learning about high-performing systems around the world, based largely on international assessments, but by no means exclusively. Ben has had a lot of experience looking at other systems. I've had some through OECD. Ed.M, as a researcher, has done some looking. So we said, okay, we picked a half a dozen pretty diverse systems, some federal, some not, some with strong national roles, some mostly state-based, but all we thought with a pretty common set of core characteristics. One of the things that was interesting to us was when and I'll sort of enumerate the short list of 7 conditions that we thought were kind of common across some of these systems, and I'll give you a couple of examples along the way. But one of the things that was interesting to us is that not one of these systems was actually pushing on the reform levers, if you will, that our system is currently spending so much time and energy on. There are not charter schools in these other systems by and large. These are not systems that allow people to take full responsibility for classrooms with a few weeks of summer training. These are not systems that think that there's progress to be made by evaluating teacher performance based on student test data. Generally, these are systems that put much, much more, that when they see a persistently low-performing school, they don't immediately think, let's shut it down and do it over. They really focus much more attention on support. So let me just quickly, in a few minutes, sketch out sort of the major items. First and far and away, the most important is high-performing systems, by and large, really focus on teachers and teaching. They focus on attracting, first recruiting from the top third of the talent pool, if you will, putting a lot of investment into their preparation, training, and support. In Finland is the example that often gets cited of a place that actually closed down its teacher education institutions, moved teacher training into the universities, raised the bar, insisted that all teachers needed 5 years of pretty intense preparation. Consequently now, 20 years later, Finland has 10 applicants for every position in a teacher training institution. Our general theory is institutions that really bet first on recruiting, training, supporting, and developing a high-quality teaching force, that allows you a degree of comfort and a degree to be relatively relaxed on a whole bunch of other things. And it enables a system in which you pay attention to the conditions that support teaching, and you can build on much more kind of trust in the confidence of a professional cadre of teachers. Second, a similar kind of attention paid to leaders and leadership. Singapore here is probably the best example of that. I should say, by the way, that Singapore also is the best example of a place that is really focused on teaching careers and trying to create parity across different career paths that strong teachers might choose. You can make as much money as a master teacher at the top of the scale as you can if you go into administration. Leaders, again, Singapore comes at the development, identification early on, recruitment, providing different opportunities for people. They really invest in developing and supporting leaders. They don't leave it to chance to decide who shows up and wants to get certified as a school principal. They focus on, the strong systems tend to focus on really a kind of evidence-based common approach to instruction and instructional improvement. These systems have typically some form of national standards, often pretty sparse and spare, but these at least provide a degree of organization and focus to the work of schools and to the work of kind of continuous improvement. At the secondary level, here we look particularly to Northern Europe, where we have systems that actually pay, in a much more balanced way, pay attention to support for getting young people launched on careers that do not depend exclusively on its higher education system to help young people actually get started with the knowledge and skills they need to be successful in the labor market. These systems have equitable financing and provide extra support in a serious ongoing way to young people who fall behind. They don't simply pay lip service to the phrase of, no child left behind, but actually have systems to catch people early on and give them very strong support. And finally, these are systems that really are based, as I suggested right at the outset, much more on kind of building a culture of collaboration and trust and support, much less on external accountability. I'm being told my time is up, so I'm going to stop. and move on to Paul.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. I had the pleasure to work with Jeff Hennig from Teachers College and Helen Malone from here at Harvard, and our focus was really on those factors outside of school that influence the capacity of young people to meet our aspirations in school. We began essentially with kind of a problem statement, and the problem statement ran something like this, that roughly 20 years ago as a nation, and certainly in this state, we set a high standard, and we set it for strategic and equity reasons. We said we want all of our children, and we said all means all, to achieve at high levels, and we said it's important economically. It's an economic imperative because that's where the jobs are going, high skill, high knowledge jobs, and it's important morally as something to do. So we set the right goal. Some of us in this nation invested in systems to achieve that goals. Others of us didn't make as robust an investment, but as we look back now over 20 years, even in the state's leading student achievement, even in the nation's leading student achievement state, progress on closing those achievement gaps has been painfully slow. We've made progress, to be sure. We're proud of that progress, but at the same time, if we keep moving at the pace we're moving, it'll be another century or two before we close those gaps. So the data's in, the evidence is in, we have an opportunity to look at it, and we see, for example, there's still pretty much an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. In fact, observers like Robert Putnam these days have said that these kinds of gaps that we have here in Massachusetts, notwithstanding our top-level performance, we have some of the deepest gaps in the nation. These gaps are getting worse, and they're actually getting worse as a result not so much of what's happening in school, because you could argue that we've done a good job of improving what's going on in school, even though we have a long way to go, but because of the comparative advantages and disadvantages of children's lives outside of school. So it's forced us all to come to the conclusion, and I certainly would articulate this in my role as Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth, that schools alone can't get the job of closing achievement gaps done by themselves. This is a conversation that educators frequently avoid engaging in because we're afraid that it nullifies the impact of the work we do, or that it sounds like we're making excuses for children who aren't achieving at high levels, or simply because the task of taking on all these outside factors seems overwhelming, and it is in and of itself. We have neither the tradition, the expertise, the resources, the authority to deal with some of the issues that get in the way of our best designed strategies for optimizing instruction. But nonetheless, without attending to those factors, our best intentions, our best efforts, our best strategies within school, within that 20% of children's waking hours that they spend in an actual school, aren't going to get us where we're going. So what we need is a system that goes beyond schooling, a more robust 21st century education system rather than a schooling system. The sort of key principles of that system, in our view, are threefold. One is, yes, we've got to optimize and continue to improve that sort of fundamental core transaction of education, teacher, student, and curriculum, and optimizing what's going on in that space. But secondly, and importantly, and this is mostly what the article is about, we've got to work harder and more effectively and more efficiently at mitigating those factors that get in the way of young people coming to school in the first place and supplying motivated effort when they get there. And thirdly, we've got to do something in the enrichment category to help students who don't come by it naturally through their own experience to have some of the advantages in after-school hours and summertime that children of upper middle class backgrounds inherit and constantly experience. So that's the shape of the system that we're looking at. It's a system, in terms of its characteristics, it's going to have more time because we're asking schools to do a whole lot these days. World-class standards when before a bell curve was acceptable. All means all children, and across a variety of topics, not just core academic subjects, but 21st century skills. So it's going to take more time. That time is going to have to be differentiated. We're going to have to recognize that in addition to the sort of child custody function that education plays, if we're talking about getting each child from where he or she is to a standard of proficiency that prepares them to be successful, that different kinds of interventions for different lengths of time are going to be necessary. So that will be disruptive and inconvenient, but nonetheless important. It's going to take enhanced collaboration. We can't ask teachers to mitigate those problems that I talked about themselves. They have their hands full trying to provide high-quality instruction to get everybody to standard. What we can ask is that we have educational institutions that connect them with the agencies in their communities that can do something about this. What we can ask is that teachers have vital connections to parents and families to help mitigate some of these problems. We're optimistic that there's more experimentation with different forms of governance and structure and organization in communities to address these. Promised neighborhoods are only one of these. We need more research and evaluation on what's working in terms of mitigating these kinds of issues, and we see that happening. We need to re-examine our way of measuring whether we're successful here. Right now, almost everything gets filtered through the standard of what we measure through large-scale standardized tests in core subjects like reading and math and science. That isn't a strong enough indicator to take into account these factors of well-being that are so critical to our children's health and success outside. So we've got to look for different instruments and different benchmarks in order to achieve these goals, a broader kind of assessment. We have to encourage the trend for general purpose government, that is state government and governors, local government and mayors to take responsibility for this kind of work. We have to learn the lessons from our colleagues in youth development who do so much in those after school hours and summertime to enrich the lives of children. So that's the general shape and outline. Better instruction, mitigate the factors that get in the way of students taking advantage of that instruction, and enrich the lives of children in the 80% of waking hours that they spend outside of school. Now it's over to you, Rick.
Well, thank you, sir. So I'll take a couple minutes to talk about this chapter that I co-authored with Olivia Meeks, former RA who's now with the DC public school system and applying to doctoral programs. Look, real simple premise as far as where we come from. You can think, to my mind, you can think about American education today largely in terms of three building blocks: districts, schools, and teachers. Most school improvement efforts focus on trying to use these better. So, for instance, much of instructional leadership is about trying to take people in a job that's the familiar teacher job with familiar kind of woof and warp, and make them better at it through coaching, through support, through giving them better instructional materials, what have you. Another school of thought, the policy-driven school of thought, is you leave this job largely undisturbed, but you measure how well they do it better. And you give cash bonuses to people who move test scores more in this role. Strikes me that none of this stuff actually asks the interesting question of, is this job make a lot of sense? Similarly, when we think about, the other half of what I tend to call a more better strategy, so that half's trying to do it better. The more half is when you look at some schools and systems that we get very excited about, it's because they are spending more, or it's because they have got teachers who are working more hours. And again, that's fine, but when you're kind of coaching a kid at anything, a first question is not, can you work twice as much at this, but are you making maximum use of the time you already have? So as we think about kind of these building blocks, district, schools, system, district, schools, teachers, simple point is we have a system that it looks the way it does because it evolved over time. First, compulsory ed law, Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647. It took from 1647 until 1970 until 90% of kids in the US were actually showing up at school every day. That's over 300 years. That's 12 or 13 generations. Over that course of time, our schools took on a relatively hardened look. Horace's Mann Schoolhouse begot the Progressive Era reforms. You guys know this. You read your Tyack and your Cuban and your Vinofskas and the rest. So question is not, were these things reasonable responses to the exigencies of the 1880s or the 1930s? The question is, are these ways that you would organize schools to serve kids well today? I would argue probably not. Three big things have changed over time. One is our expectations have changed. In 1900, 1 American in 10 finished high school. Today, we don't just want everybody to finish high school, we want them actually to have rich and rigorous education. Second thing that's changed is the tools at our disposal. 30 or 40 years ago, if you wanted a kid to get tutoring, you drove that kid to a tutor, or you drove a tutor to that child. Today, if you want a kid tutored in Mandarin, as long as you have some kind of device somewhere at a library or home or school, you can pop that thing open and get one-on-one whiteboard tutoring in Mandarin or Arabic for $14 an hour. Third thing that's changed is the labor at our disposal. Half a century ago, over half of all college-educated women became teachers. In the 1960s, the average college grad was going to keep a job, was going to have 5 jobs before they retired. Today, 15% of college-educated women become teachers, and the average college grad holds 5 jobs by the age of 30. It's not, do you like the traditional model? It's not, is it nice to have teachers hired who are terrific and stay 30 years? It's that it was a model that fit a particular world that doesn't fit today. So what we argue in this piece is that rather than rush to come up with fanciful new solutions for how schools ought to look, especially because we're operating in DC office buildings where we have absolutely no idea about any of these things, that a useful starting point is to actually begin by unbundling and disassembling all of these familiar rules and routines. So rather than talking about how do we get 3.4 million better teachers, how do we think about what it is teachers do? How do we think about teaching instead of teachers? If you think about the tasks that a teacher does, think about the old University of Michigan time use studies, for instance, that of instructional time, teachers are only using about 65% of any given instructional hour for actual instruction. What are teachers doing in the course of their day? They're mentoring, they're coaching, they're giving feedback, they are, machine gunning content, either well or poorly, at disinterested students. They are also patrolling oral hygiene in elementaries, walking kids down hallways, wandering the cafeteria. A question about whether or not we can make teachers better at everything they do is think about what happens. When we talk about importing medical model, there's enormous reasons to be cautious. But if you took your child into surgery, if you're watching your child in surgery and the pediatric surgeon was 90 minutes into the operation, and she started peeling off her gloves, and you said, "Doc, what's up?" And she said, "Oh, you know what? I've done my 90 minutes. It's my turn to go unload patients off the ambulance. But don't worry, the worst pediatric surgeon in the state is going to take over." You might think that was an inefficient use of talent. Yet, every time I walk to a school, I don't care how much they tell me they're using instructional rounds. I don't care how thoughtful they are. I don't care how hard they're trying to get better at the old model. I say, hey, can you show me your worst 4th grade reading teacher? Show me your best 4th grade reading teacher. Show me your best colleague at coaching their peers. Show me your worst colleague at coaching their peers. They are each teaching reading to for 90 minutes to 28 kids. There are no inducements or supports for them mentoring their colleagues outside of the goodness of their hearts. And what we have taken is the machinery of an 1880s manufacturing of a shoe factory, and we are simply trying to repurpose it through good advice and good intentions. And I don't think that gets us that far. Thanks.
All right. I promised you that it was going to be lively. All right, so the thesis of our chapter was that the organization of American schooling, which as Rick says, took its modern form in the progressive era, that the central problem is that the sector as a whole didn't organize around teaching as a profession, and instead thought of teachers as kind of clerks at the bottom of multiple layers of hierarchy. So if you think about professions, not just medicine or law, but also engineering, accounting, etc., what does it mean to have a profession? What it means to have a profession is that there's a core of knowledge that guides how people in that profession work, that people have to be trained in that knowledge at the beginning of their career and certified at a minimum level of decent competence before we let them practice. And then that there are ongoing mechanisms that assure that that knowledge and practice continues as time moves forward. So to take the medical example, not only is there training on the front end, you've got things like rounds, which was the inspiration, I think, for Liz and Richard's work, in hospitals, which assure that knowledge gets used down the road. So when Rick says he goes into 4th grade and he sees one teacher and another teacher, believe me, I have seen that pattern. We spend a lot of time in schools. We spend a lot of time basically just following kids from one class to another around schools. And the difference in the level of kind of practical knowledge between what some teachers know how to do and what other teachers know how to do is basically sort of fairly criminal from the point of view of the students who are experiencing that. So in the absence of a profession to assure this kind of consistency, what we have are essentially people teaching themselves on the job. They enter the field with what they themselves report as largely unuseful training from teacher prep institutions. And then, some people basically kind of figure it out with the help of colleagues, and other people, it's more challenging. So there's one big consequence of this failed professionalization, which has to do with practice. And then a second has to do with status and respect. That professions, and a lot of this is tied to historical reasons around gender, which I'm sure you know, but in the absence of a professional core, it's very difficult for teachers as a whole to demand respect either from the public or from policymakers, which in turn relates to pay and other issues. And what happens is that policymakers look out over a landscape. They see, 40% of the kids not graduating from high school in a big district. They're not just going to sort of leave well enough alone, leave it to the people in the schools. They seek to intervene, which from where they're sitting is really the only responsible course to take. But the problem is that as they push forward on external accountability mechanisms, teachers become resistant. They become angry with the people higher in the system. That leads to sort of distrust between the levels. And the whole kind of system of technology doesn't provide the increase in performance you'd like to see. So very broadly, picking up, Bob and I both did some international OECD research where collectively we went to Canada and Finland and contributed to one of these volumes, and we can talk in the Q&A about the ways in which those countries are different, size, culture, et cetera. But very broadly, you could say that in the US, this is our world, right? We, as Bob referenced, we hire less than our most talented people. We move them into a kind of highly feminized, semi-professional field. We equip them with an underdeveloped knowledge base and put them in a weak welfare state, to tie to the points that Paul was talking about. In a place where there's a collapse of manufacturing, segregation of cities, and then not that surprisingly, things don't go as well as we would hope. Their students don't do as well as we would like. That leads to declining public confidence. Policymakers seek to intervene with regulation. Teachers' unions resist because they are unhappy with reforms that they feel like are scapegoating their work. And then the whole cycle makes the field less attractive to talented people, just starting the spiral all over again. And what we want, again, this research is in its early stages. At the moment, it's more kind of descriptive than causal. Like, we should talk about this. It's not as simple as I'm presenting it, but this is a short, big idea, provocation kind of forum. So very broadly, you could say they hire among their most talented students into a more professionalized field. Knowledge development in other countries often happens through the ministries of ed as opposed to through universities, which means universities have many virtues, but aligning knowledge with what other people want from the knowledge is not among them. So they create a knowledge base that's more closely rooted in practice, give them much more extensive training, support them within a stronger welfare state, which in turn leads to improved performance, increasing public confidence, which, as Bob says, allows for increased trust and autonomy, which in turn makes the field more attractive for talented people. Doesn't that sound more like the kind of system you would like to work in? Very broadly, I would say that there are kind of, in the US, we talk about sort of hard and soft theories of change. People who believe in hard theories of change are people like Michelle Rhee, who say if we don't demand accountability for outcomes, we're not serving our students, particularly our minority students, well. And I respect that position. But taken by itself, it's a limited strategy because it only sort of gets at one of the levers of the chain. If you look across fields as a whole need to do these things. They need to develop knowledge, they need to train people in those knowledge, they need to make sure that knowledge is used in practice, and they need to align it with system accountability. Some of our most successful charter networks have essentially sort of taken on these various challenges. They're studying their own teachers to try to develop more practical knowledge. They're very selective in who they hire and give them intensive feedback. They have careful feedback processes within schools to give teachers feedback over improvement. And they align all of that around system accountability. Now, if we want to get from the things that a few charter schools do to the system as a whole, we need to fill in these other layers, and we can't depend on the charter schools to do it. More generally, as a nation, we need to use the variety of levers at our disposal to develop knowledge, train teachers, get processes used in schools, and only then, within alignment, create accountability. Nice.
Thank you. All right, last, and then we'll open up for discussion. So there are three problems I'm interested in solving. One is what Paul referred to, which is that too often demography is destiny in this country. So that, to me, is the big problem we have to solve. So it should not be that your zip code, the color of your skin, your socioeconomic background, your language, your disability, the teacher you get when you walk in the door, that any of those things determines what your life outcomes can be. So that's the big problem. Within that, two other problems. One is that children are capable of far more than we generally ask of them in schools. The third one is children are bored in schools. So I'm interested in solving all three of these problems. And my co-authors, who are Richard Elmore and Doug Lynch, who at the time we wrote this was at the University of Pennsylvania and brings a background in executive education and business, the way we thought about it is, you know, the real problem is we're focusing too much on schooling and not enough on learning. And that if you really look at how things are shaping up in the 21st century, focusing on schooling isn't going to get us there. It's not going to help solve all those problems. So you hear variations of that with my colleagues, but we're a little further out on the continuum. So to try to solve those problems, the question is, where is learning happening? Well, by and large, most learning is not happening in schools these days. So I want to show you a couple images to show you that. So this is a graphic from the US Department of Education National Education Technology Plan. And the black represents how much time, and this is a waking hours bar graph, people are spending in formal learning environments. So you see that 18.5% is that K-12 span, and then it gets skinnier and skinnier as you go out across the lifetime. All that light blue, that's informal learning environments. So when Rick says we can do more, but what are we doing with the time we have? Sure, right? What are we doing with the time we have in schools? But look what's happening in all the time we have outside of schools. What are the informal learning environments? So our chapter is really about, let's think about the walls of schooling as being much more permeable than the way we think about them right now. And let's just acknowledge that some of those shifts that Rick talked about mean that schools are no longer the portal through which all knowledge flows. It used to be that schools and teachers and the people who decided what got taught really determined what people had access to in terms of learning. That's no longer the case. So here's a second image for you. If, some of you may recognize the Khan Academy site here. If, for example, you're a 9th grade student in a little town in Arkansas, as I was once upon a time, and you have a geometry teacher who so does not know her content that she cries every day in class because she cannot do the proofs and asks you to come up and do them. And you say to yourself, what am I doing in this classroom? And why is she in this classroom? How am I going to learn geometry? Well, you know what? You don't have to rely on a very kind but not well-equipped teacher in a little town in Arkansas. You can go to Khan Academy and go learn geometry if you want to. You don't have to rely on luck of the draw who you got for that year in your class. So we can keep a fairly traditional model of somebody's deciding what it is worth learning, and somebody's deciding how I'm going to demonstrate it, and I'm going to go figure out how I'm going to learn it. So but I don't have to rely on a teacher in my classroom to do that. You could also imagine a future in which we don't necessarily have to show up at a building every day, where families who get a lot more voice, perhaps, in this future, get to decide themselves what's worth learning. And they get to work with their student and their community to build a set of learning experiences that let that student develop into all that they can be and not be bored. And so, like, you have a learning plan, you get up when you want to get up. You're a teenager, you get up at 9:30 a.m. instead of at 6 a.m. to get to the bus. You hop online, you take your Arabic with some other people, then you go with your soccer team and you go play a little soccer. Then you decide, I'm going to go to the Khan Academy site and learn what LeBron James tells me about what muscles you use to jump. And then I'm going to go meet with some of my friends and we're going to have a discussion about Romeo and Juliet. And so you have a set of learning experiences that you can put together. So in this future, there isn't one set of adults that gets to determine what's worth learning and how you're going to learn it that day. Students and families have a lot more influence over how they learn and what they learn, and you recognize that we know a lot about learning that we're not representing in schools right now. If we look at how companies educate folks who are adults, they're spending as much, US businesses are spending as much on adult education as higher education is spending right now. So we have this notion, especially those of us who spend a lot of time in higher education and in pre-K to 12 education, that that's where learning happens. But in fact, when you ask people, and if you thought about what was your most powerful learning experience, I bet at least half of this room would say something that was outside of school. So our future is about how do we make learning the focus as opposed to schooling.
Great. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation among ourselves here first, and then we quickly are going to open up the conversation to get the rest of you in. As Jal said, when we began, we were really clear. Actually, it's ironic. One of the things that both Jal and I had in mind when we first started talking about this project was that I'd been involved in a project that began in 1990 called the Pew Forum on Education Reform. And at that point, this was just right around the beginning of the standards movement, it was relatively easy to assemble a pretty diverse crew of people, all of whom kind of said, this looks to be the next big wave of reform. We might have differences about how we think about it, but suppose we decide we will come together, meet periodically, as it turned out over a whole decade, and really try to understand and follow this reform as it played out. 4 or 5 years ago when we started talking about this project, it was really clear to us that there was no single predictable path that the next wave or next generation of reform was going to take here. So as Jal said, we deliberately, rather than trying to force a consensus, we actually tried to sharpen the differences and create 6 quite distinct visions of possible future. Listening to these presentations, it does strike me that despite that effort, I think it's relatively easy to group. They're clearly listening to Liz and Rick. There are some strong kind of common themes there around, you can think of as both opening up our conception of what's the range of adults that we might want to have interacting with kids, and opening up our whole notion of schooling itself to learning. Listening to Jal's presentation and mine, again, you can see the kind of common denominator themes around what happens if you actually put the building of a profession into a much more central place in one's thinking about reform. So what I want to do is first invite you guys to kind of question one another a bit, but also, where do we think the real flashpoints are? What are the dividing issues that really separate out these visions? In other words, what's not bridgeable? And then I want to come back at the end and talk a little bit about where are there potential syntheses here. So who wants to jump in with either a reflection on someone else's presentation, or just a response to this question of where are the real divides here?
I'm not sure. It seems to me that there are real divides between the different visions. It's none of the visions is whole in and of itself. In other words, you're not going to do it all with just teachers. And you're not going to do it all by paying attention to the outside factors. And the internet isn't going to be a panacea either. So we're going to have to develop some sort of a mixed model. And we've got scarce resources in terms of the amount of energy we have for policy and practice changes and the whole change movement in general. And we have a scarce amount of financial resources. So what are we going to prioritize? It seems to me that's where we're really going to get into the struggle, whether or not we should go hell-bent to break down the temporal and spatial boundaries of school and open it up to the internet and really make an investment to do something that our profession, at least in K-12, has not done, which is bring in the outside world of technology in a way that's really meaningful or central. Or are we really going to bend over backwards and shut down our ed schools, as you're talking about, and flip the salary structure so we pay people a lot of money?
I wasn't saying shut down ed schools.
Yeah, God forbid.
Move teacher training someday.
Teacher training schools. Yeah.
So, well, Joel, let me ask you to respond to this. So, if you look at American medicine, for instance, a century ago there were no specializations. Today there's about 200. There's about 7 million folks in American medicine. That's 6 million, give or take, in K-12. Of those 7 million, probably 1.5 million get a lot of professional respect. There's 700,000 MDs. There's tons of RNs and EMTs who don't feel especially respected, who don't feel especially well compensated. But by divvying up the work so that, you know, cardiovascular surgeons spend a lot more time actually doing the stuff of cardiovascular surgery, and somebody else is actually patrolling the cafeteria, somebody else is actually doing paperwork, somebody else is offloading and unloading patients up front. But one of the things is in divvying up the roles this way, you make it possible to train and retain and compensate people who are especially good at helping their clients. But you also mean that of those 7 million folks, fewer of them get that kind of. So I see synergies there in what we're talking about. If what you're doing is saying of the 3.4 million folks in classrooms today, only some portion of those guys are going to get this status and this, but I'm not sure whether or not you're saying all 3.4 million get to be, you know, cardiovascular surgeons.
So I'm kind of two minds on that point. So on the one hand, it certainly makes sense to me. So if you look at a place like School of One in New York, for example, right? They've taken the idea that one way to think about teaching is you could potentially make it more specialized. So rather than have elementary school teacher in 3rd or 4th grade trying to teach all subjects, you could have an elementary school teacher who just taught math. You could have an elementary school teacher who just taught fractions. And they taught fractions to, like, you know, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade students at different levels and to do different operations with them. And their specialty could be that. And they could get better at that in a way that is really not possible right now, given the kind of diversity of things that they're asking. So one thing that I think is really interesting about professions is that they bound the scope of their work. So if you're getting divorced, say, if you go to your divorce lawyer, they'll help you sort of figure out the paperwork and how to sort of separate your property. And if you go to your therapist, they'll figure out, you know, what to do with your love life or how to put your life back together. If you're the kid of a divorce and you go to your teacher is supposed to basically, like, help you put your life back together and teach you math if you're an elementary school teacher and teach you English and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, I could imagine a world where roles were more defined and specialized. Some of those roles required more skill and more pay because the clear problem in the sort of the medicine professionalization example for 3.4 million teachers is just looking at the budget, like the money isn't there. It's got to be differentiated in some way. My concern is that kids get a lot out of the people with whom they interact every day. And if those people were explicitly less skilled, less intellectually interested, et cetera, than they are now, and that took up a good portion of their time, and those people were supposed to be helping translate materials that were online and so on and so forth, I just worry that it could go bad fast. One, when we talk about specialization, we tend to talk about it in terms of learning objectives, kind of, right, content narrowly defined. That's one possibility.
But there's no real reason that, right, that you're actually going to cut it that way, right? If you think about, this is when my friend Diane Ravitch has given me grief about, I don't want kids taught by computers. I'm like, Diane, when you go to see, you know, a radiologist, you're not getting treated by a machine, right? A trained physician is using technology so that they can actually diagnose you more rapidly, more efficiently than they used to. So one question is, rather than a teacher being a 5th grade fraction specialist, are teachers actually getting trained, you know, say University of Michigan, Deborah Ball's, right, diagnosis remediation around elementary math, where folks are actually able to use the tools at their disposal that didn't used to exist to more rapidly kind of work with kids. But then what that gets us to is that, right, if we actually look at how teachers use their time, we've got highly trained professionals who are on a contract, they got a 450-minute contract day, 180 minutes, say, of that day are already doing non-instructional work duties. So we're taking highly effective elementary literacy instructors and we're having them spend time, do this other stuff. And then of the 270 minutes, we actually have them in an instructional role. In an elementary school, they might only be spending a quarter of that time actually working with kids closely. A lot of it might be content conveyance. A lot of it might be team teaching with the art teacher while they're covering it. So it's not just in terms of that narrow specification. I wonder if we start to rethink these roles and we want people who are especially good instructionally not to be spending a lot of time doing prep duties and stuff. Right, somebody else is probably going to do that junk. And I wonder, like, in your scheme, do we want those people who are doing less valuable tasks less well, do we want to think of them like RNs who we don't care as much if they come and stay for 6 years and it's okay to get that in a community college? Or do they all have to have this highly sophisticated, highly rigorous, prestigious training?
So just 2 quick points on that. One, so the move to make education a profession in the US, the most prominent group that has sponsored that has been the Carnegie group. And when they published this report in 1986 called A Nation Prepared, they advocated for a lot of what Rick just said. Right. They said teachers are being asked to do all this bus duty and copying and so on, and that's just not a good use of their time. If we want, skilled people, we should, narrow the role to the stuff that focuses on teaching. So we're clearly in agreement there. And I think we also are in agreement that, I think one thing that Rick and I have agreed upon over the years is that, like, we like stuff done well. And it's really frustrating to go out in the world. I know it's hard, but it's really frustrating to go out in the world and feel like kids are not being served with the best level. So if by dividing the world up in some way, we could assure that each of the functions is sort of done more or less well, I'd be happy with that. And it seems like it's a kind of empirical question whether some of those things should become like super specialties, which would require actually even more training, and some of them you could be more like RNs. As long as they're, I guess my sort of bottom line is we need to describe what the job is. We need to describe what it would mean to do it well. We need some knowledge that is sort of shared about what that looks like. And we need to be assured that people in those roles can do those sorts of things. And that may lead to different levels of training, different levels of pay as per what those things are.
Plus, we have some very different conceptions of what those roles are. I mean, in the public, to change those roles in terms of what people envision a teacher doing, and then, to have a teacher who's going to adapt to these realities that are going on in the internet outside and use that tool and coach in that way, that kind of utilization that you're talking about, is a very different conception of a teacher than a lot of people have. We're in a fundamentally conservative society about change in education, so it's not just our own limitations as policymakers or professionals, but it's also what people want the schools to be.
And these issues, obviously, we've batted around for a long time. Teachers themselves tend to be resistant, by and large, to differentiation. I can remember going on tour in Massachusetts in the late 80s, and we were putting forward a pretty sweeping teacher education reform package, and Al Shanker came along for the ride, and the late president of the American Federation of Teachers, and he argued that a mass profession was a contradiction in terms. And he spoke enviously about the medical profession, arguing that if to copy that model and create more differentiation and make it, more rigorous, demanding training to actually be at the top of that pecking order, it really would have changed the status of teaching. Now, maybe that's a kind of pipe dream, but that was, I thought, an interesting argument. I want to shift to a different topic, and that's kind of the technology. As the sort of resident Luddite on the panel, and the person who's been around the longest in schools, I continue to, and maybe I'm out of touch here, but I continue to be struck by the fact that even though online learning, for example, has made much more penetration than I would have predicted, schools still generally are, when you compare them with almost any other institution, tend to be at the slow end of the take-up, if you will. So for Liz and Rick, both of whom have some premise around this shift from schooling to learning, and as you frame it, is going to imply a much more and better use of technology. Is that done around teachers? Help me think about this.
Well, part of it is that schools are really poor overall at using technology, but kids aren't.
Right.
So part of our argument is that it's already happening. So the future is now. Kids are already using a lot of technology. It's when they come to school that they're supposed to turn it off and put it away and use the fancy equipment to write a paper. So part of the question is, what would it take to have the adults take the lid off and let students explore using the technology? And I do think that's to the previous conversation, changing the role of teachers fundamentally as the ones who dispense knowledge to ones who facilitate knowledge and help students access it and develop it and expose them to knowledge they may not have known was there. And so I think it's what's the role of teachers and what's the role of kids? So who gets to decide what to learn and how to learn it? And I think one of the things we differ on is what is the role of the learner in learning, not just what's the role of the teacher.
I wanted to say, just as an aside before Rick goes, that as you were talking about the student and structuring their time in the different way that you posited with getting up at 9:30 caught my attention. The idea that...
Good way or bad way?
Well, it's in a different way than what we have now. We're trying to get high school students up at 6 o'clock in the morning is ridiculous. Yeah. But at any rate, what you implied, I mean, what you suggested as a schedule implied a lot of discipline and structure that a student would undertake on their own. I don't know how realistic that is. You know, from my own experience of watching my own children or other children, I mean, the internet has rich, huge, amazing resources, but also endless distractions. And so part of the role, it seems to me, of teaching is going to be guidance, discipline, structure. How do you utilize that's out there in ways that make it productive time for kids?
And how do we prevent the rich getting richer? In other words, the equity challenge here. How do we make sure that the kids who need the most support are going to get that support and not sort of just operate on the premise that if we simply open up, you know, take the lid off in your terms, that kids who are lagging behind will suddenly, you know, kind of get on fire. Rick, you wanted to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when we talk about technology, I only know one technology that's actually had a sustained and systematic impact on teaching in school. And, you know, when it was introduced, educators were deeply concerned that it was going to be misused, and it was worried that it was going to delegitimize instruction. But the printing press and the book were fairly successful. And the Lutherans had a point of view that, there was, if you remember, right, if you remember the introduction of the printing press, there were real concerns among educators who were mostly in the church hierarchy that kids left to their own devices with this printed material would learn it wrong. And instruction up till that point had meant you had to be in a room with the teacher. And to kind of Liz's point, that meant your education was only as good as the person in your village who was teaching you. So the transformative impact of the book was you could suddenly learn from any expert anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the world, who wanted to write their thoughts down on paper. And then the other transformative impact of the book was previously you could only learn when you were in kind of talking distance from your instructor. So education was sitting there and having the instructor tell you stuff. And the amazing thing about the book was it was theoretically possible to take it away from the school and go learn at home and then come in and thereby flip the classroom, because you would now read the stuff away from school and come in to discuss. So what's interesting to me, right, is when we get excited about Khan Academy and the rest, all of these are variations on a theme, right? All they are is better, cheaper, faster, more agile ways to kind of do what the book has done. And just like there's lots of really dreadful books out there that don't teach much or teach poorly, and just like educators have long misused the book and had kids read aloud in class, and just like in many circumstances, kids have not read their biochem chapter the night before, so the teacher could not simply lead a lively discussion, that there's enormous limitations in how this technology is utilized. And what's interesting to me is how many friends of mine who are out there, enthusiastic proponents of technology, suggest that somehow all of these other design considerations go away because we are doing the book in another form. And what's equally surprising to me is how many educators and how many critics of technology mount against technological tools exactly the same criticisms once leveled against the book, except now they cling desperately to the book and say technology is a threat because it upends reading. So I think the real question on this technology stuff is design issues, and I love what Liz is saying. Right? The real question is, how do we regard our time with students and the role of schooling? How do we make sure that we are taking full responsibility for using that time well? And how do we also open that up and design it in a way that leverages all the other stuff which is available, that wasn't available 3 decades ago?
Yeah, when we set these teams working on sort of the development of these visions, we basically said, don't think incrementally, start with a relatively blank slate. But at the end of the day, we also ask people to at least think a little bit about how do you get from here to there? And maybe we could do one quick round before we open this up. Paul, since you're freshest from the field and know the constraints involved in moving to this model where we're really trying to link schooling and with access to a broader set of services. And you've worked on some of those issues. You were on the governor's cabinet that cut across education and human services. Thoughts about how, some plausible next steps to move toward the vision that you and Jeff articulated?
Well, I think we're on our way in some respects. One of the things I didn't mention enough in my earlier comments was just the amount of data. If I think of the single biggest change that's resulted from standards-based education in this country, certainly in the schools of this Commonwealth, is the centrality of data in conversations among teachers. 20 years ago, you could go into a school, you'd never see anybody, you'd never hear a conversation about data on student performance informing instruction. You'd hear lots of other conversations, but you wouldn't hear that. Now, it's almost impossible to go into a school and not hear. So that's a way in which technology is having an impact in our world outside of the delivery of instruction that's having an impact. I think that data gives us evidence that helps us think more deeply. One of the things I love about standards-based reform is every year it forces us back, it forces policymakers and the general public back to the consideration of the difference between our aspirations and our performance. And each year we have to recommit ourselves based on that data. And so I think, through charter schools, through innovation schools that we're doing here, through various experiments with technology, through wraparound services and councils that we've instituted as a result of Race to the Top, through the Promise neighborhoods, through various kinds of portfolios we're developing on children that give us a much clearer picture on who they are, what they've been through as they arrive in classrooms. We've got a lot of experimentation now going on in terms of what this 21st century education system looks like. And I think, institutions like this can play a huge role in terms of monitoring what's going on there, reading the tea leaves, looking at that data, doing the research that's necessary, and then getting that back out into the public domain so the public becomes aware of what's working, what's making a difference in the lives of children, what's, after all, preparing them to be successful, because that's what parents want and that's what the public wants.
Rick, unbundling?
2 places to start. One, policy advocacy rulemaking, which is more interested in starting to remove specific impediments to new ways of solving problems than with imposing new best practices. One of the problems, because so many people, to my mind, view schooling as a mechanism for improving the world rather than as an activity of interest in its own right, is that the idea that it will take a while to figure out better ways is unacceptable. So we only take away as we reimpose, and that leaves no room for the unbundling or rethinking. Second place to start is same dynamic at the practitioner and leadership level, is that leaders spend so much time and energy trying to do things better, trying to coach, mentor, cultivate, stakeholder buy-in, the rest, that they spend, in my experience, remarkably little energy trying to ask how do they unbundle, how do they rethink, how do they reconfigure right now, and what's possible.
Liz?
All right, I'll go with 2 as well. First one, talk with kids and try to understand from them where and how learning is happening in their lives. Basically do a learning map, talking with kids and try to understand what it looks like right now. Second one, really explore what some educators are starting to do now around competency-based learning and mastery-based learning. So you can think of it kind of like Boy Scout or Girl Scout badges, if you're familiar with those, but how do we have a way that we articulate what's worth learning and a way of validating that doesn't necessarily flow through schools? And I think exploring that could be a promising avenue.
I think one way to think about policy is that there are kind of streams, lots of streams going at a given time, and you're best off sort of trying to jump on some ships that are already moving and gently steer those ships in ways that seem more beneficial rather than sort of trying to turn the tanker around and go the direction you want it to go. So with that said, it seems like the combination of the Common Core standards, given that schools have had a lot of trouble meeting existing standards, if we're going to move towards even more ambitious standards, it stands to reason that schools will also have trouble meeting more ambitious standards. And so it seems like a kind of fertile policy moment to pursue the kind of teacher learning standards, what would need to happen on the teacher side that could be paired with what we're asking on the student side. In the last year, The AFT has come out with a report, where Randy Weingarten called for a bar exam in education. The NEA has put out a report. The Council for Chief State School Officers have put out a report. And so we essentially have at least 3 different organizations arguing that this is a good moment to rethink what it means to certify teachers, what initial training needs to look like, how ed schools need to change, how we should incorporate new providers, et cetera. That seems like one really promising moment. And then the second is, I feel like the knowledge, the sharing and vetting of good knowledge, something that gets less attention because it's not as sexy, but it's just critically important. It's just, it's really unclear how you could get any kind of consistency in practice without people having some similar knowledge in their head. And there I don't think that you're facing kind of barriers the way you are in lots of areas of policy. You've just got a big vacuum of people. There's no institution that's essentially charged with developing practical knowledge that teachers could use and share, and vetting it in some way that made that decent. So some combination of government, philanthropy, et cetera, could work on that problem. Bob, do you want to take a shot at that question?
Yeah, so you actually, your first example was one of my 2 as well, around this growing consensus around the sort of professionalization agenda. In addition to the examples you cite, actually one of our 3rd-year ED/LD students is doing a residency in Iowa, where he's been staffing a task force that really has put together a pretty kind of radical set of proposals around kind of professionalization, with kind of teacher leadership ladders built in, requirement that all students, all starting teachers really be in a kind of residency with much more support than they've typically had. It would, if enacted, this would be at least one example of a state that's actually acting on the best evidence we've got from other countries. The other example is one that I've been more directly involved in, and that is a couple of years ago with some colleagues here, we put out a report called Pathways to Prosperity, which drew very heavily on the best examples of European systems that combine academic and technical education at the secondary level, and that really move many, many more kids through with skills and credentials by age 20 or 21 to actually participate in the labor market. We now have a whole group of states that have said, okay, we buy the argument, let's start working together to figure out an American adaptation of these models. That said, Jal, I think it's over to you to take up the next piece of this to get these folks involved in the conversation.
Great. So I'm sure you have many thoughts on what has passed. So before we go to Q&A, we thought we would just kind of take a little bit of the temperature of the room. We're not going to ask you yet which of these ideas you prefer or what combination of ideas you prefer, but we did just want to get some kind of initial reactions just to get some sense of what folks were thinking. Okay, so is there anybody who didn't get a clicker on the way in and would like to have one? All right, I see a hand in the middle. Anybody else? A hand over there. Hopefully we can get you some clickers in short order. For the rest of you, we've got 3 questions for the moment. Are you persuaded, how persuaded are you of the kind of urgency or necessity of the reform of American schooling? A, B, C, or D on your clickers. What do you think?
What are you doing?
They told me no. Oh, wait, one more?
Oh.
Whoa. All right.
Reset it. Jason, can you reset it?
We're going to reset from up top. Hold on 1 second.
You're reinforcing my skepticism about technology.
Yeah, there you go. While we're waiting for the technology, something that we were...
It's not the technology's fault, actually. So, okay, there goes.
It's always the human's fault here.
It's the lack of a professionalized operator. I'm telling you, like, technology's not going to solve it.
Should differentiate roles here.
All right, there we go.
We could have started drinking a half hour earlier.
All right.
Interesting.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know whether that's self-selection of who chooses to come to this particular panel or whether it's something that passed, but that is not what I would have suspected. All right. So Liz, if I just click it one more time, are you good with that?
Yeah.
Again?
You're good. Stop.
Poll is open. So I hope the terms are clear. These are basically the order in which we gave the presentations.
Yours sounds less risky than if you say blow up schools.
Yeah. But you don't have to blow them up.
I know.
You have to have somewhere to send your kids.
It's frightening. I know. I get it. It's got connection. That's not very risky.
Just so you know, we were whispering, Rick was saying, mine sounds less risky than if you say blow up schools.
Which is the typical Elmore presentation of the same chapter.
All right.
Yeah,
Look at that.
see?
Okay.
There you go.
All right.
Interesting.
Still seems kind of risky.
There you go. I like it.
All right.
The big question.
So which one has the most, we've seen which one is the riskiest, which one has the most kind of potential upside?
I'm sure who did these summaries.
What was that?
I'm not sure who did these summaries.
The old polling story. Whoever writes the question
Yeah, that's right.
controls the answer.
All right.
There you go, baby.
See?
I think they were brilliantly written.
That's good. That's good. Risk reward.
Rick, you're
I'm
not
tough.
faring well on.
I'm risky for a little payoff.
Yeah.
All right. So last thing before we move to Q&A, why don't just take a couple of minutes to turn to your neighbor and try to process a little bit of what you've heard. Just you can talk about the results. You can talk about what you thought of the presentation. Just take a couple of minutes to just talk with the folks around you, and then we'll move to audience Q&A.
Fascinating. Yeah, if Richard had been here, the risky, like, it would have been much riskier on the E.
Have you been here the whole time?
I just can't do it.
I'm surprised. I feel like you're. I think you didn't really get to the unbundling.
Yeah.
Rick or me?
Rick.
Rick.
So
Yeah, I'm
are
not
we
sure.
meeting with her?
I think potentially you have the most upside.
I would
I'm just
think.
not sure whether we could ever get there.
Also, these are the reasons I'm not employed in a school of ed.
We need
I don't know if it's my sweet spot audience.
No, you know why I think part of it
We
is
have to go upstairs and
when,
sign books.
especially the way you talk about today, when you talk about unbundling,
For a few minutes.
it's on upside, I
snacks.
think about like what's happening with the learners. And the unbundling sounds a couple steps removed from the
Don't eat any snacks.
learning. So it's like you have to draw that thread through, or it
What?
feels like you're
Not right now, no.
rearranging the
You take a
furniture
nap?
kind of thing. That you're focusing on the system. So I think the missing link is, in terms of potential upside, is just
Took a
how
10
does
minute
unbundling help us actually get a better outcome? It's like taking the cardiovascular example kind of all the way through to education.
Tony Wagner's going to be first to speak, I would say.
Oh my God.
I know.
All right.
Perhaps the reminder that this is.
All right, what?
Ask a question.
Here we are.
I
We're-
think that's how it's going
We're
to
ready to get whatever questions.
Talking among themselves.
Yeah. So your people seem pretty psyched.
There you go. How do you
It's
earn
hard to
that 3 to
argue
1
against.
payoff, baby?
It's a really good turnout.
Now we have to deliver. This is the problem.
I think that the
I think you're.
We can't pick.
I think you're right.
Now we gotta do it.
I think you're right. I mean,
content
when
of the panel is
Donald and I were
actually
talking
better
about the
than
clicker
the
questions, and he was like, I
think
want
I've
to
seen
ask
better
a
turnouts
a
for far worse
combinatory
panels.
question about which ones would you
this is-
combine,
this
but
is-
they're, like on clickers, you can't really do
pretty
that.
substantial.
But that is a question, which is if you were going to combine
go a lot
that
of
and
places
still
and
have
people learn
focus,
things
right? In
like
terms
this.
of you got to prioritize, you got to focus.
I thought we
Would
were
you pull
drawing the line at
elements of
3.
different ones? Are there ones you just wouldn't go for yet, or what? But
didn't come through?
you're right that none of them is sufficient on their own, of course. I mean, even though Richard says ours is like doomed to happen no matter what, so you might as well just accept the reality. I don't think. I mean, you're right that you still need design. You still need that can create more inequity or less depending on your design.
That's really.
I actually asked for a re-review because the reviews were very positive. And they looked at it again and they said these were the reasons.
Yeah.
That's the politics of it. But it is true. I mean,
I wasn't planning to go anyway, so. Yeah, I was supposed to be on another panel that got turned. They converted from a symposium to a poster session or one of those bland things, which is ridiculous.
but I'm not sure what the impact is going to be in K-12.
You know, I think
Yeah, I
In
mean,
higher ed, you got the economics driver. People just don't want to pay 60, 70,000 a year to send their kids to college.
all right. Anyway, we can talk more.
We,
I almost
stand
picked
up.
up on your reading example. That was one of my flashes when I was writing the chapter, was to use the printing press.
oh, you
But
might
there's a
suggest
democratization,
that they
right?
direct
There's
their
a
questions
who gets
to
access,
individuals,
who
if that's
gets, and I do
appropriate.
think you know you take
All right.
the encyclopedia. or
So
the Bible and you
this is
play
the problem with Liz's system. You know, once you take the lid off and you let people start talking, once you take the lid off and you let people stop talking, they don't want to come back to a formal structure. All right, so we're gonna do a little Q&A as usual. I'm sure there will be a number of people who want to ask questions, so try to keep the questions relatively brief and more, question-like. If you want to direct them to a particular panelist or two, that would be good. And for the panel, let's not feel like we all need to weigh in on every question.
All right. Where's the road?
Doesn't sound like it.
Now it is, sorry. In spite of your request, Joel, I have to make a very brief observation and invite respondents. It seems to me that all of the questions and discussion thus far have been entirely around education delivery systems with no discussion of outcomes. And I'm struck by the fact that we have a revolution in the commoditization of content knowledge going on, where very, very soon students will not have to go to any classroom or have any teacher to acquire all the content knowledge they want. Indeed, I think we're at a point where the world cares less and less how much our students know and much more about what they can do with what they know, which is a completely different education problem. And yet we have Common Core standardizing outcomes as all kids college ready, when in fact the majority of our recent college graduates, 53%, are either unemployed or underemployed, mostly because they lack real skills. So rather than all kids college ready, it seems to me we're going to need all kids innovation ready, which is a radically different goal. Comments, please.
I'll take it. So to me, that's exactly why the future that I proposed makes sense.
But only if you reframe the outcomes. I agree with you, Liz. I think what you're talking about makes enormous sense to kids and intuitively to different outcomes, but they have to be named and assessed.
And that was why my number 2 suggestion for next step was around trying to name the competency and the mastery system and connect that, sure, to our schooling and education system, but also loosen the hold on who gets to say what's worth learning and who gets to say whether it has been learned. So you and I are like this, Tony. We're good. We're good. But I think the outcomes question we didn't talk a lot about up here, and we have some underlying assumptions about which outcomes are worth pursuing that we kind of alluded to. But I think one of the things we all share is looking for outcomes that are not the ones that we are most concerned with right now. I mean, going beyond achievement test scores, you guys tell me if this isn't true, but I think embedded in all of the visions is a notion that there are outcomes about earning a decent living and making a good life for yourself that go far beyond where we're spending most of our energy assessing right now. And I think all of the visions we proposed are trying to get us closer to that.
I think, Tony, we've talked about this before, but I mean, I think that some of the standards that we talk about are stated in terms of skills, and some are stated in terms of knowledge, and I think it's true that we all agree that you could go broader, and the way to measure the impact of education is just too narrow if we're going to talk about math and English and science. Not to apologize for those as standards, because I think those are important, but it has to go beyond that. But having said that, and I think some of that's been tackled in the Common Core, and I think we could do more. The other aspect of this, at least from a public policy standpoint, is it isn't just about knowledge and skill, for that matter, as a commodity. It's also about what we do with children in our midst. Well, we have a society that requires all adults to work, essentially. So as much as the internet is coming up and creating a revolution, look at what it's doing in higher education. I mean, it's transforming higher education. But the economy's driving that, because people don't want to pay $50,000 or $60,000 a year for a high school diploma, for a college diploma anymore. But in K-12, families do want their children taken care of. So we're going to have to strike a balance between that child custodial function, having children in a place, learning skills and knowledge about which we have some kind of agreement through our systems of policy development as to what that is, and at the same time taking advantage of some of these other opportunities and dealing with some of these situations that arise outside of school.
Let me just add one quick thing, which is I think that the trade-offs between breadth and depth are fairly complicated. I'm doing a study right now of what's called In Search of Deeper Learning, which is looking at high schools that are trying to do more ambitious instruction with their kids. So the Gates Foundation Measures of Effective Teaching study finds that about 20% of the classrooms which they videotape, more than 3,000, were engaged in what they call ambitious instruction. So those are things at the top of Bloom's taxonomy: analysis, synthesis, creation. And one of the biggest barriers if you go to schools is that teachers are trying to cover a lot of things. And that's one of the biggest things that stands in the way of that. So I would clearly be in favor of kind of fewer things and more depth, and students having some choice over that. But I guess I'm not quite where Liz is in thinking that there aren't, that there aren't both some range of things you should know, and also that if you explore things only in a kind of project-based, kind of deep diving way, and then from there you go out to try to gather the knowledge, which is sort of the best version of project-based education I've seen, you don't have the sort of whole framing that you may need to understand. So today I was at a school, in a very good suburban school, and I saw an excellent program in what's called green engineering. And the students were essentially trying to solve a variety of problems, and it was very much sort of lab-based. They had long times to work on these things over weeks. And they described a model very similar to what Liz suggested, in that they were sort of reaching out to universities, and when they didn't know something, they would get a paper from this professor or that professor to help fill in what they needed to know. So it was definitely not Sage on the Stage, and was much more sort of student-directed. That seemed very healthy. It seemed like one of the most interesting things going on at the school. But was there kind of physics knowledge that the students could build on as they were doing these projects? And where was that knowledge going to come from? And without it, there's a difference between sort of superficial projects and deep projects. So some sort of balance between those elements needs to be struck.
Why don't we move on?
Yeah. All right, I don't know how to turn it on, so I'm just going to talk. To build on that, I'm going to throw it right back at you, I think. We develop more and more knowledge that's important every day. The really simple example is computer science. More and more jobs are available and demanded and so forth. And the way we've dealt with it so far is tacking it on to the end of the school system. They'll learn it in college. They'll learn it in postdocs. I'm in a master's program, et cetera. So it seems to me there's three simple, radically oversimplified things you can do with that. You can eliminate things we have to teach. You can synthesize things together into interdisciplinary things. And you can throw things completely out of the curriculum. So, thoughts? I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure I grasped the entirety of your question. It seems to me, the example that you started with, I'm very familiar with. We have a variety of computer programming jobs in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, for example, that are going begging because we don't have people who are qualified to take them. And it wouldn't require a BA degree. In some instances, I have a son who runs a thriving internet business. He's ready to hire people who are high school graduates, as long as they have the set of skills. And we haven't done as effective a job as we might have done in connecting our secondary schools with preparing people to be career ready. That's part of what Bob's Pathways to Prosperity is about. How do we begin to incorporate some thinking in our secondary schools about the application of knowledge and skill? I'd argue, as Liz mentioned earlier, one of our biggest problems in high schools in Massachusetts is boredom. We have kids who are bored stiff. And they're bored stiff because they don't see any purpose, hope, or connection between what they're learning and some real-world application that holds promise for them. And so I think we've got to do a better job of thinking that through and doing that earlier and connecting opportunities in the world of work with what students are doing in classrooms. And that should be part of the work of curriculum development.
It seems to me that whichever of these possible futures we endorse, we are, as educators, preparing to operate in a system that's very unlike what we experienced as students and maybe where some of us have been teaching before. As a school of education charged with kind of preparing everyone in this room for that future, what do students here and faculty here need to be doing differently to adjust to that changing reality?
Rick, you want to take that one?
Well, we're going to punt that one to Rick to start with, since he's the only one of us who doesn't spend all of his days here. So he can tell us first, and then we'll claim it.
I mean, it's a chicken and egg gig. It's unrealistic to expect professional schools to train people for non-existent roles, but it's going to be hard to justify moving to roles for which nobody's prepared. I mean, right? It's not rocket science. The only way you actually, I think, start to migrate, there's two strategies to migrate this. One is the Flexner report kind of approach, where, there's 1,300 plus teacher preparation programs in the US. The Flexner report approach would, somebody wins the model contest, everybody else basically gets shut down over a period of a couple of years, and then new emergents have to come in. But, then there's no evolutionary room. There is a model that's the model. The other approach is that training programs have to work in concert. This is kind of the stuff Tony Bright talked about when he took the Carnegie job, is you actually have to create development nodes where training programs are working with school systems, whether those charter systems, districts, whatever, who actually want and are going to hire the people who are being trained in ways, whether that's going to be different job or different roles or different kind of approach to the profession. Problem is, it's hard for districts to do that under existing state regulatory frameworks, accountability systems, and federal rules. So part of the struggle here is which thread, where do you find the thread that you actually pull to get this thing started?
I think it's, oh, go ahead, Paul.
Well, I was just going to say quickly, I mean, I think the role of a school of education like this one, in terms of, again, my problem statement is we've got huge achievement gaps that we've got to close to prepare young people to be ready for success. I'm not talking about gaps on exams. I'm talking about being ready for success in work, in citizenship, in life, in lifelong learning. So in order to do that, we need to invent a new education system built on top of the one we inherited from a century ago. If you're going to focus, as this School of Education does, on research, policy, and practice, I think you've got the tools and you've got the strategies. The question is, you need to develop and project the vision. You need to migrate the work out of the School of Education into the general public, into policy circles, so that the research actually makes a difference in altering perceptions and altering practices and policies.
I mean, one quick point on from the sort of professions perspective. About a century ago, ed schools made a decision, the top ed schools made a decision to focus on training administrators over training teachers, and you still see that today, that the most selective schools mostly train administrators and less selective schools mostly train teachers. So, could you have Harvard Medical School or Harvard Law School without training doctors or lawyers? No. We train teachers here, but not that many. So there is just a sort of disjuncture. I think in terms of sort of where we are now, since we're not sort of starting from scratch, I would prefer a sort of pluralism kind of world. And we've already seen a widening array of different people coming up with different models of trying to train teachers. And the research suggests that it's not so much, is it alternative, or is it urban teacher residency, or is it traditional programs? It's that within those models, some people do it really well, and most people don't do it that well. But the elements that they use within those programs are pretty similar, field-based, tied to practice, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'd like to see essentially like setting some sort of standards as to what would be good, let different types of institutions compete to see which ones could produce good training, And then, you know, some will thrive and others won't.
Yeah, but that doesn't actually address, I mean, to my mind, the root problem. Because, right, I mean, even if you have faith in residency and think it's a good bang for the buck proposition, which I generally don't, or even if you're excited about relay, or if you're excited about high-tech, high-ed school, I mean, mostly there's training people to do the same role in the same way in these schools, and whether or not one has any sympathy for unbundling as a proposition, even your kind of professionalization, these folks are being dropped into roles in schools and systems where they are continue to have the same expectations, the same so, I mean, part of the challenge is you can, you know, bust your hump trying to improve the quality of preparation and even sustain PD, and actually have PD that makes a difference, which would be a nice change. But so long as the organization, which these folks are embedded, remains pretty much the same, I gotta wonder, you know, whether you don't just ultimately alienate the same folks that you're trying to change.
Hi, I'm Kathy Skinner. I'm the policy director for the 110,000 member Massachusetts Teachers Association. We're the state affiliate of NEA. But I was a member of the NEA Commission on Effective Teachers and Teaching. Rick was one of our critical friends. And that was 22 accomplished teachers from around the country. And one of the things that we grappled with was this whole notion of professionalism and defining the body of knowledge that professionals need to have. And what we bumped up against, and I'd like your thoughts on this, is the problem that we have 52 or 3 licensing agencies around the country. So in Massachusetts, where we have a highly effective, well-educated workforce, it's not surprising that the students in Massachusetts do well, whereas in Mississippi, where practically anyone can become a teacher, it's not surprising that they don't do so well. And so when you want to have an organized body of knowledge, which is almost a federal mandate, but schooling is essentially controlled by states, how do we get over that hump? So that's my question to you.
Could you just frame that last part again? Who should decide, or?
Well, I think we should decide. Teachers should decide, and I would argue that the commission already decided what that body, we define what the body of knowledge is beyond content. What are the skills and habits and dispositions that effective instructors have to have? I myself am a nationally board certified teacher, and everybody else on the commission was like me. But the problem is that when you have state licensing agencies who oftentimes just want to lower the bar so that anyone can get into the profession, and they dismiss the knowledge and skill that practitioners have as actually being worthy of acknowledgement, because they want to just get people in quick and cheap. We're interested in not getting people in quick and cheap. We're interested in getting good people in. We're interested in looking at Finland. Finland blew up their school, the way they prepared teachers. That's how they got to be where they are today. They took a cold, hard look, and they said, we are doing this the wrong way. So we looked at them. We looked at the Flexner report. They blew up medical education. One of the medical schools they wanted to close was at this university. So, I mean, I think you have to blow things up sometimes. But the problem is you have a function of the state, and in order to get sort of a national acceptance of what it is, what is that body of knowledge, you have to get 50 states, DC, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, to work together, and that's not easy.
Yeah, but I mean, the good news, Kathy, I would argue, is that I would have said a decade ago that the problem of getting the states to agree on common standards for students was politically much tougher than we actually were making some progress. National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, the agreement, National Council for the Accreditation of Teacher Education, the work that Linda Darling-Hammond was doing with the chiefs to try to take the board ideas and bring them down to sort of standards for entering the profession. I think that's now back on the table in a much more serious way. That is the idea of actually, whether it's a national bar exam model or whether it's taking the national board standards, which are designed to bypass the political process, problem that you point out, by moving into a terrain that wasn't challenged. That is saying, we're going to do something that nobody else is doing, which is we're going to certify accomplished teaching, you know, with people who've had at least 3 years of experience. I think there's now pressure building to take that model and bring it down to the entry level. And I think there's going to be more willingness on the part of states to actually, just as they have around the standards for students, to give way around the separate licensing standards for teachers.
Great.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for having this forum for us. As a classroom teacher, educated, sort of thrown into the fire via the New York City Teaching Fellows, I agree with many things you've said. I hesitate to agree with some other things. Firstly, I just want to make a quick comment about data. Are we using data effectively? When I'm teaching 8th graders in New York City, I have reams of data that show that they're reading on a 3rd and 4th grade level. Yet I don't have the time to get them up to grade level because I am teaching them to take a test that is on an 8th grade level. I already know that they can't pass that because they don't have the reading skills and the math skills to do so. So is that effective use of data for my children? I'm not sure about that. And I think with this conversation, we've done a lot of sort of hows and whys of things, but as a teacher on the ground, what can I do when I'm sort of tied to these reforms that I, as a classroom teacher, don't see working? I have my 3rd graders now. I teach in Roxbury, BPS public school. I don't want to teach in a charter, who come to me weekly. Oh, testing again? Why so much testing? We're sucking the love of education from our children, especially our urban school students. So what can I do as a teacher when my evaluations are directly tied to ANETs and other varieties of MCAS? To instill my children with a love of learning and that school is a place to come and learn and be curious and take risks. But then we have to do these tests too that, you know, it's a catch-22. I don't really know that I want them to do well beyond the evaluation aspect because I don't think it's teaching them to be creative, technological, meaningful citizens of the world, which is what, to me, education is all about. Thanks.
Well, I'll briefly take your first part on data, and I'll leave what teachers could do to someone else. Rick and I actually just put out a piece coming out in like a week in Education Leadership about data. You wouldn't have guessed that we could write together, judging from the panel. And the piece essentially argues that data is a tool. It's a mechanism that you can use as part of a much larger improvement strategy. So not only can data be much more diverse than test scores, we argue in the piece that data actually requires more skill and not less for the people on the ground. Data will not solve your problems. Data is like a mechanism through which you can investigate the social world. And one of the problems with the way in which, because data was so tied to accountability in this country, from the point of view of many practicing teachers, it's this sort of horrible thing that was imposed upon them without their say-so. Whereas I think of, data as all teachers start, from Dewey forward, you collect data every day. You watch, you see what works with your students, you make changes, et cetera. And so I think we need to sort of basically kind of reset our relationship to data, both expect less and think more broadly about what it can do.
And I'm sympathetic to your point about too much testing, but I got to tell you, I was supervising student teachers out of Harvard and Jamaica Plain and Roxbury and stuff in the 90s. And if you are somehow imagine that students then were desperately in love with learning, and that only because we now are testing, I just think that's nuts. In fact, what I could absolutely recall were teachers at various Boston area schools where the Harvard student teachers were frustrated because they only had 6 or 7 engaged students, and their teacher mentors thought they were doing great. Because they said, well, yeah, there's 30 kids in this classroom, but only 6 of them actually want to learn. The other 24 are only here because they have to be. And and as much as I have issues with some of my friends who are strong proponents of standardized assessment and test-based accountability, and especially this focus on this thing they call achievement gaps, as much as I have qualms with some of that, the idea that teachers were doing their work hard and taking care of every kid, and that this has somehow been a uniquely bad thing is just nuts. There's trade-offs in all of this. And what I always say when I'm training educators on this is it's perfectly fine to say that this is a crude and imprecise and often counterproductive exercise, but you got to come up with better solutions. And you got to explain not just in your classroom, but in your least committed and least effective colleague's classroom. How can those parents be confident their kid's going to get well served absent this testing? And once you've got a response to that, then you've got a way to actually move the policy conversation.
Last point on this. I don't think it's an either-or proposition. I think it's important that there be voices from the field. If people have gotten too carried away with the tools, that it's crowding out important aspects of the curriculum on a real-time basis. It's important that voices from the field rise in opposition to that. At the same time, having said that, I don't think it's a mutually exclusive proposition that we have periodic demonstrations of mastery that give us a reading on where students are and how they're doing, and give teachers a read on what they know and don't know, and at the same time inculcating or introducing young people to the kind of excitement about learning, to curiosity, and to the joy of mastering subjects. I've seen it done repeatedly in schools all across the country. I don't think it's a mutually exclusive proposition.
Hi. I'm a student here at the International Education Policy Program, and my question for you is threefold. First of all, when we all don't understand what constitutes a good school system, how do you know the international leaders are really leaders? Because the most frequently used criteria to judge is just some PISA scores or TIMSS scores, whatever international assessment we have. So that's the first fold. The second fold is, when you look at the international leaders, how do you decide which are the factors that led to their success? How do you identify the causal links? And the third fold is that I haven't heard anything in the international comparison about how technology is used in other countries, in international leaders, how social support system is there existent in other countries. Particularly, do the international leaders have a lifelong learning environment? Do they have a better, like the society are more prone to learning, have a higher value for teachers than other societies? I think those pieces in the puzzle are missing. Thank you.
My turn, I think, for this one. Really great questions, I would say. On the first one, actually, I've been pushing to, PISA's provided a lot of really useful, very interesting background data. It's not simply the assessment results, but it's the very rich data about just a whole host of things. And one reason that I think a lot of us have tended to focus so much attention on Finland is because it's the country where social class is the least predictive of student performance. It's the country where there's the least variance, both within school and between schools. So somehow they've managed to create a system that has a high level of consistency as well as a generally high level of performance. How much of that comes from social conditions, social supports, other things that are basically outside the direct control of the schools? We can argue back and forth about that a lot. But I think you've given me an opportunity to make a little commercial here, which is that on this question of actually trying to disentangle what are the causal factors that have led some systems to routinely produce higher performance than others? We've just gotten a little bit of money here at the school to support research on exactly that question. And we'll be, particularly for doctoral students who are likely to be around for a while, we'll be encouraging people who are interested in this to kind of come forward and work with us. Remind me again of your third question.
Technology and social
support
system.
Yeah, the technology piece I don't know, but the social supports thing I guess I've already kind of referenced. But the other point I was going to make was that I'm interested in shifting the conversation from how 15-year-olds are doing, which is essentially the question that PISA is designed to answer. And by the way, PISA really deals primarily with measures the students' ability to apply knowledge, not simply how well they can repeat back what they've learned, but to what degree they're able to take their knowledge and apply it to novel situations. This gets back a bit to Tony Wagner's observations about, I think it's a more useful predictor of the ability of people to function in the adult world. But I'm interested in shifting the conversation from how societies are doing with their 15-year-olds to how are 25-year-olds doing in the society. And this gets to at least my particular interest in strategies that will enable a much larger proportion of young people to succeed. So when I think about systems, I look at Switzerland, for example, where while we're dealing with 20% unemployment rates among young people and kind of youth unemployment rates that are twice those of adults, Switzerland has less than 5% youth unemployment among its 16 to 19-year-olds, which to me says that's, again, a measure, not the only measure. But my point is we need a much richer set of measures than simply looking at test scores at one age grade in order to make ultimate judgments about which systems really are doing well by their young people.
All right, so we've got, I see 4 people lined up left. I'm cognizant that there is food waiting upstairs in reception, so let's try to keep both the questions and the answers short.
Okay, I think a lot of the problems originate with the insular nature of the industry and the fact that we're not reaching out to other disciplines. I know, Liz, I was hoping to hear more about your work with the management school, and also with Rick, I was reading your chapter earlier today, talking about some of the leaders who are out there who are walking around. It's like, okay, you don't have to have your hands tied behind your back. That's not really what's going to happen. It's like, but I like them here. They want to be the old manager. And but the old school was you take intelligent adults, and I tend to think teachers like children have a great propensity for learning and for growth. You take intelligent adults and you try to contain them for 30 years, and that doesn't help them be all they can be. How do you, as leaders of administrators, get them, and how do you bring in the other industries to help teach your instructional leaders to also be very well-rounded general managers?
Yeah, we tend in education, I do this myself sometimes, to say, well, that's fine, that worked there, but it won't work here with my kids in my context. We have a tendency to need to see it with our own children to believe that it's possible, I think, especially in the United States. So one thing that's a little different about the United States and other countries and how they see knowledge is we have people who come to HGSE internationally who are like, why don't you guys use the knowledge you have? Because we come here to learn it from you, or we come get it, and you're not using what you have. So there is a bit in the United States of a culture of, I have to see it, and wherever it works somewhere else, it doesn't work here. So I think one thing is to try to figure out what can we learn from other industries. So the little statistic I referred to before is how many businesses are training and developing adults in really powerful ways, much more powerful than most of our PD, our professional development. And the core tenets of effective PD outside the education sector match the core tenets of effective PD inside education. It's relevant, it's ongoing, it's tied directly to what you need to be doing day to day, so you have some purpose to it. So part of it, I think, is just us getting a little less parochial and saying, what can we learn from GE? What can we learn from the Army? What can we learn from other places? Anything?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, over half of all superintendents were school administrators before the age of 30. More than 80% of superintendents have never worked a day in their life outside of K-12. I teach at the Rice University Jones School of Management, right, in an MBA program there or here. You've got folks who want to run hospitals sitting side by side with these sleazy aspiring energy traders. In ed schools, right, if you're a teacher, you go ahead, you want to get your, you want to get your step, so you go ahead and you enroll in an EDM program. You then eventually do ed leadership and get your EDD. In the entirety of that time, you were only taught by people who have, who know education. All of your classmates are people who know education. What people in education think is cutting edge use of data or fiscal modeling is stuff that was considered dated in many other less significant sectors in the late 60s or early 70s, but we get very excited about these things. And it comes massively out of this, voluntary ghettoization and inbreeding, which we can trace back, as Joe was saying, to, Coverly and these guys who actually built what they thought was a best practices model of ed leadership around the tenets of scientific management and Taylorism a century ago. So, yeah, I mean, I think rather than have these conversations about, do you meet Baldrige criteria? Importing the notion that there are other smarter ways to do various of these tasks in various walks of life, and being interested and curious, and educational leaders as part of their training being exposed to how Vegas casinos actually monitor dealers and minimize cheating, and being exposed to how Google or 3M actually go about cultivating and recruiting talent and keeping it energized would be enormously useful. Yet, the closest we ever come is occasionally we take these dog and pony trips around the world where smug, self-interested PR departments take folks on walkthroughs for 8 or 12 days through China's schools or Korea's schools or Finland's schools, and people come back wowed and dazzled. And I find it less than enthralling.
Each of you has laid out an ambitious vision for the future of education, but obviously the implementation of that will depend on a political process. And I'm curious to what extent you think your visions are likely to survive the political process. Where are the bright spots and where do you think the challenges will be?
When I started mine, I mentioned, for me, the unit is the state here. And can I imagine a state deciding to take a really serious look at outside the U.S. and rise above American exceptionalism and actually try to put together a system built on what seems to work better elsewhere? Yeah, I can imagine maybe one state starting to do that.
In order to make the kinds of changes that have been talked about here, there needs to be a pervasive sense of urgency, both within the sort of political classes of policymakers as well as in the general public. So to do this massive change that's discussed across the board here would be monumental and highly unlikely in most states. To do pieces of it, and Jal mentioned earlier, you jump on the policy or political opportunities that you have as things move through the system and build on top of some of the phenomenal things that are already moving. I think there's some chances there where you could see a state move big time in the direction of professionalization of teaching, or you'll see a state who decides, as Massachusetts might have decided but hasn't, that to be on the cutting edge of the internet revolution in the delivery of instruction in K-12 services. So I think there are possibilities here, but I think you're going to see a piecemeal approach rather than a sweeping approach or a major investment in one of these troughs.
Well, now I feel bad because I feel like that was a fantastic ending question, so I feel like I'm taking a step back. But my question was about professionalism. And one of the predominant changes we are seeing in education right now is a change in teacher evaluations. I personally work in an urban district in Worcester, and we had a sweeping overhaul in our teaching evaluations this year. I'm wondering if you feel like the changes that they made are a step towards professionalism or a step back, because personally I'm seeing that you're collecting all this data, you're sorting it in your folders, you're getting observed a few more times a year, but it kind of just ends there, where we can get rid of the bottom of the barrel and the worst, but the best don't even get a pat on the back, and everybody in the middle just ends up staying in the middle.
It's a complicated question. I think the best result, the sort of most auspicious consequences of the standards movement more generally, and I'll tie teacher evaluation in a second, is when external accountability essentially kind of triggers internal accountability. So when people within schools use data, investigate what's happening with their kids, make changes, et cetera. We see that with some charters, we see that with some traditional publics. So when those processes work together, it can be really healthy. But as I've said, that is more the exception than the rule because of the way in which it was introduced in the US. I'm also struck on the teacher evaluation debate that we spend a lot of time evaluating teachers on their outcomes, and we spend very little time trying to define what it is that they should actually be doing. I call this the tight, loose mirage. So like, we were supposed to be sort of tight on ends and loose on means. And the idea is like, well, okay, we're not taking away your discretion. We're just telling you what you need to aim towards, and you're going to figure out how to get there. And I tend to think of that, especially as standards get more ambitious, as we're going to ask you to do something that neither you nor we know how to do, and we're going to hold you accountable for your failure to do that. And I don't see that as a sort of step forward for professionalism. But at the same time, you can't have a profession without having some accountability to outcomes. A profession is defined by its ability to do certain things with a certain level of competence. So profession needs to define what it is, needs to be willing to hold itself accountable to those outcomes. And I'm sure that Rick might say that the profession has not shown a great willingness to do so. And I think that would be a fair point to date.
I have to take a whack at that. I'm a Worcester Public School parent, and I actually voted for the evaluation procedures that you're talking about. I think when we took that vote, we were, number one, I think not subscribing as a State Board of Education to the idea that evaluation is everything, or that this particular set of changes was a silver bullet that would revolutionize the field. If we want to improve the quality of teaching, there are a great many things from A to Z that we have to talk about. Evaluation is one of them, and frankly, we were exposed to a lot of districts that, from a management standpoint, were delinquent in doing teacher evaluation. where you'd have novice teachers who'd go 5 and 6 years without any evaluation whatsoever, or at best drive-by evaluation every other year. And this wasn't an exception to the rule, this was commonplace. So one of the things the State Board was saying at the time was evaluation ought to be important. It's not a new idea. It shouldn't be a foreign topic to administrators. We've always evaluated. So come back to the notion of evaluation and that we have a professional obligation to use evaluation as a developmental tool for improving the practice of all teachers, high-performing teachers as well as poorly performing teachers. So that, number one, I think was the main statement we wanted to make. Secondly, yes, we did take a step toward trying to link, however gingerly, student performance and teacher performance. There is a connection. If you're a parent, you see a connection between what your child learns and the quality of your teacher. Can we get scientific about it to the degree that many states charged off and attempted to do? I don't think so. But we said at least it's relevant. It ought to be informative and not determinative. And finally, we said teachers ought to play a role in their own evaluation, as well as students in the secondary level ought to play a role in evaluation. So I think we put a lot of markers down on a high-quality evaluation system. It's up to local districts to implement it. It takes a lot of training and time to get it right. But I think putting a marker down on evaluation as a developmental tool, not a gotcha tool, but a developmental tool, I think is a good thing to do.
I'm going to just come down a little different because I think it's very similar to the woman's point before about her concerns about the standard, over-reliance on assessment. Look, nature abhors a vacuum. 99% of teachers in system after system are rated effective. Nobody actually believes this is the case. There's no confidence that districts are acting on this, even though principals and superintendents and boards have large deal of discretion to actually go ahead and evaluate aggressively and do something. And what happens when folks in schools and systems don't act, eventually policymakers get enough grief and find it hard enough to defend it that they feel they have to do something. And the nature of the world, right, this is just Montesquieu stuff, right? The nature of the world is legislative authority does not get to write nuanced, thoughtful bills because they don't get to implement them. They have to write categories of stuff. They have to go ahead and move ham-handedly because that's the nature of legislation. And so one of the frustrations with the current era of reform, which is, I think, both reasonable but also people's own damn fault for having not moved earlier, is that policymakers are at a point where they feel they have to act. They are acting in crude and heavy-handed ways, and now people complain about the fact that this stuff plays out in a crude and heavy-handed fashion, and it does. And so the only real response is to get the hell ahead of the curve on this thing and fix these things so that policymakers can explain why they don't have to write new rules.
All right, I'm seeing the signal from the back that we are very short on time, so 30-second question and 30-second answer.
All right, so this is not my question. My role tonight was as trained human, harnessing new technologies in Twitter, facilitating the live stream viewers' informal learning by reading their tweeted question. Here it is. This is from Susan, a teacher following along in a story in New York who will not be privy to free food in 1 minute. Sorry, Susan. In 1 minute, she says, what do we do to keep career without college kids amongst the college and career ready kids? Maybe that's a Bob Schwartz question.
Sounds like a Bob Schwartz.
Say that again. What can we do to...
What do we do to keep the career without college kids amongst the college and career ready kids?
Yeah, well, first, I mean, the notion that some people are being prepared for careers and other people are being prepared for further education has to be seen as a false dichotomy at this point. We need to pay much more attention to preparing all kids for careers. Tony, I think, cited these horrendous underemployment rates among four-year college graduates under the age of 25. And it should be clear to everybody at this point that you need some education beyond high school, some form of post-secondary certificate or degree if you're going to have a prayer of making it in this labor market. So forget the false dichotomy. Everybody needs both.
Excellent.
Boom.
All right, so I want to thank the speakers for being here today and the audience for being very patient. If you could exit, the people running this have requested that if you could exit out the front and drop your clickers in the basket, that would be great. The food is upstairs in Elliott Lyman Room. And John Schnurr will be here a week from today to talk about his organization, America Achieves, if anyone is interested in that.
Everything you say.
Thank you.